Welcome to our 5-minute Bible study in the book of Romans. Today we're at verse 18 in chapter 1, which is really the beginning of the substance of Paul's letter. The first 18 verses of chapter 1 that we looked at the last few sessions are really Paul's introduction. He says, I'm writing to you, Romans, about the gospel, which I'm not ashamed of. It's the good news of Jesus, power of God to save us. And now in verse 18, he begins in great detail to explain why the gospel is such good news. So let's look at these first few verses 18, 19, and 20, as Paul begins to talk to us about the wrath of God. He says, the wrath of God is now being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of people. The godlessness, I should say, and wickedness of people. Those who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, for God has made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, that is, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Now notice Paul begins by talking about God's wrath, or his judgment upon sin. You might begin to wonder, why do you start an explanation of the good news of the gospel by talking about the wrath? Because the gospel is God's response to judgment. You see, because of our sin, we are under judgment. We are under the wrath of God. And God responds to that by offering us the good news of redemption, the good news of salvation. You can't really hear that the news of Jesus is extraordinarily good until you know that without it, we are all alike under the judgment of God, under the wrath of God. I want to say a word about the wrath or the anger of God. Sometimes we've had a misunderstanding as if the wrath of God is his anger at sin. He's really ticked off with us because we've done wrong and he's out to get us. And many people look upon God as an angry God out to punish us for our sin, but it's not that way at all. God's wrath is simply his response to what sin does to us. You see, sin destroys us. God's wrath is that destruction we bring upon ourselves when we sin. Think of it this way. There are certain laws in this world that cannot be changed. For instance, if you run face first into a brick wall, you're going to break your nose. It's not the wall's fault. It's not God's fault. It's simply the physical laws of this world God has created. If you run face first into a concrete wall, you'll break your nose. That's being under wrath. That's the consequences of your own mistake. Likewise, there are moral laws built into the world. God created the world so it reflects his own nature, his character, his morality. And when we violate the ways of God, it's like running into a brick wall, a moral wall, and we break ourselves upon it. So the wrath of God is when we break ourselves upon the immutable laws of the universe, when we run into the nature of how God has made the world, which is in his image. And thus sin causes us to break ourselves. So being under the wrath of God is not that God got angry with you and is just going to punish you. It's just simply the way things are. When you violate the nature of the world, which is made in God's image, you end up breaking yourself upon that world. You run into that brick wall. And so Paul is saying the wrath of God is now being demonstrated. Our sin has broken us. And the good news of the gospel is that God has come to save us. God has come to rescue us from our own folly and from our own sin. That's why he says the wrath is now being revealed. Now, we've brought this on ourselves, he says. What may be known about God is plain to all. God has built into the nature witness to himself. All you have to do is open your eyes to see what God is like. But in our sin, we've refused to do that. In our sin, we've pretended that God is not there, so we are without excuse. We saw the wall was there, and we deliberately ran into it. So there's no point in blaming God for our broken nose. And there's no point in blaming God for the brokenness of our lives when we deliberately sin against him. God's heart is broken at what we've done. He's hurt that we've violated his law and brought wrath upon ourselves. And so he sends us Jesus to rescue us from our own folly. But it starts by understanding that without Jesus, we're trapped in our own life of mistakes and rebellion. God's wrath is being shown that if we ignore who God is, if we pretend that moral law does not exist, we break ourselves upon it. Notice what else Paul says. Though they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile. Their foolish hearts became dark. They claimed to be wise, but they actually were fools. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and like birds and animals and reptiles. Paul says in our own folly, we've broken ourselves upon the moral law of God, and then we've decided we won't worship God, so we've made our own gods. We've made idols, other things to worship. This is the wrath of God. God allowing us to destroy ourselves by our own sin. That's what his wrath is all about. Paul wants us to understand that is now being revealed clearly. Understanding that, he says, now turn to Jesus. For Jesus can save you from this. Jesus can save you from your own mistakes, from your own sins. He can rescue you if you'll just let him. The gospel is good news because it's God's response to our sin that we might be saved from it. We'll continue this tomorrow, but just keep in mind that when we break ourselves upon the law of God, it's a tragic thing. But God always offers us a way out in the good news of Jesus Christ, a way of redemption. Amen and amen. Hope you have a great day today, and I'll see you next time in our 5-minute study in the book of Romans.